So hello and welcome to the final component of this course, Gender and Literature. So we covered some literary texts, we talked about certain critical theoretical terms, we talked about the certain of the key words in gender theory, in gender and literature, and then we talked about, obviously we studied, examined some literary texts, some very selected literary texts which we chose for a study, which sort of reflected some very complex representations of gender in certain social situations, certain political situations, certain ideological situations, etc. So, as you know, the texts which we've covered already, they include Shooting an Elephant by George Orwell, Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad, The Fly by Catherine Mansfield. The first text which I did was, of course, Munshi Premchand's Shatranj Khiladi, or The Chess Players. And then, of course, we did Look Back in Anger most recently, which was a very important piece of drama, a piece of theatre, which examined the very complex relationship of gender and political identities in a certain kind of political ideological climate, right? So hopefully by this time you have an overview of the content of the course, you have an overview of the theoretical premise of this particular kind of study, this particular kind of research, gender and literature. We have an overview of the very complex relationships between society, identity, gender, ideology, etc., and how these identities, these correlations, these complex entanglements, how those are mutable. So these are something which are constructed by certain economic, political, cultural conditions, and obviously whatever can be constructed can also be deconstructed by certain changes in those same conditions, right? So we talked about how gender is not really an abstract phenomenon, but a very complex material phenomenon. It's something of an entanglement between abstraction and materiality, because it's informed in many ways by economy, it's informed by many ways by some very material apparatus which sort of configure and reconfigure gendered identities. So what we'll do in this particular segment, which is the final segment for this particular course, we'll look at how gender is represented in popular culture. Right? So how the very complex identity formations, reformations in popular culture, and to what extent are these formations, reformations identified or should be identified or examined through the material apparatus of the culture, right? So for instance, we talk about economy, we talk about consumerism, we'll talk about, and a big part of what we'll do now is looking at advertisements and how advertisement is consumed, how media is consumed, so how media in turn creates gender identities, and how gender identities play up in representations in media, etc. So obviously media is something, popular media is something which we consume every day, sometimes consciously, sometimes unconsciously, but a big part of what we are, a big part of how we behave, what we say, how we think, is sort of premise on the way we consume popular media, right, and the way we consume popular culture. Right? So we talk about how advertisements sort of address a certain kind of population, advertisements address a certain kind of sentiment, advertisements create a certain kind of effect, and obviously we've spoken a lot already about the very complex relationship between gender and affect, which is something which we saw directly in Look Back in Anger, and also in other texts which we studied, and how gender is basically very interestingly dialoguing with affective identities. So identities created by affect. Affects such as emotions of awe, fear, reverence, love, etc. Affects of association, affects of disassociation, etc. So all these things come together in creating and recreating gendered identities. So gender, of course, as we know by now, hopefully, is not really something which is out there. It's a text. It's a very material text which is premised, which is configured by some very material apparatus, right? And what we do in this particular course, what we have done to a certain extent already in this particular course, is we have identified and examined the apparatus which creates a certain kind of gender identity in a certain kind of cultural climates. So there is no such thing as the gendered identity as we know by now. There are different kinds of gender identities which are obviously pluralistic, they're premised on certain cultural conditions, they're contingent on certain cultural conditions, they're performative, and obviously they're reliant on the way we look at identity formations and reformations. Okay? So having given you this sort of a preamble, we'll now move into what we will do in this particular course, the last segment of it, that is looking at advertisements. So advertisements, as you know, before I dive into the specific advertisements which we will look at in this particular segment, advertisements, as you know, is basically some kind of a speculum of consumption. It's a mirror, a speculum, the word speculum means mirror, it's a mirror for consumption. It sort of reflects in a very interesting way, sometimes in very uneasy ways, the way we consume the culture around us. Right? And obviously the way what consumed over here connotes, it carries connotations of commodity formation, it carries connotations of how the human body, the human mind, the human identity is commodified endlessly and then obviously consumed subsequently in cultural media, in popular media, in political media, etc. Right. So what we'll do now is we'll look at obviously we will look at a variety of advertisements, but more specifically there are some key texts that we'll study, and obviously the word text is very, very complex, because you can use the word text. We're talking about literary text, we're talking about pieces of literature, pieces of films, pieces of cinema, advertisements, music pieces, etc. So anything which can be analyzed, anything which can be examined and then deconstructed should be considered as a text. So in a way, if you use the definition, then if you use the definition in terms of gender studies, the first idea that should be triggered by the definition is that gender itself is a text, right? It's a very textual formation. It's a very textual construct. And obviously, because it's a textual construct, it's dependent on the context. It's dependent on the cultural conditions which produce it, right? And obviously, because it's been produced, because it's manufactured, it can also be unproduced or manufactured and reproduced and remanufactured. Okay? So gender identity obviously is a very playful, performative identity, as we have seen, what we discussed very briefly, Twelfth Night by William Shakespeare, which is a very complex drama about different kinds of identity formation in a very, very sort of mutable, plastic, performative space of gender. Okay, so advertisements, as you know, they rely a lot on performativity. Advertisements, they try to produce an effect, and they will also try to produce affective identities. Okay, so identities which rely on effects such as different kinds of emotions, different kinds of sentiments. Sometimes the effects are created deliberately, they're designed deliberately to create sentiments of affiliation. Sometimes they're designed deliberately to create sentiments of disassociation, moving away, sentiments which sort of repel you, the sentiments which attract you. And obviously when you're branding a product, when you're branding a commodity, when you're converting an object into a commodity, you do it through affect in advertisements. So I'm not going to go too deep into advertisement studies, although it's a very rich kind of research. Lots of excellent books and articles have been published on looking at advertisements as some kind of a affective study of in a certain social situation, certain cultural conditions, and how advertisements can be used as a very faithful representation of what we consume, how we consume, what is the manner of consumption, what is the matter of consumption, and why are we consuming what we consume, right? And of course, there are other complex questions such as why do certain objects go out of style? Why do certain commodities go out of style? How do certain commodities come back in style? Okay, so what we find immediately when we look at advertisement, even a very cursory look at advertisements will reveal that when you're branding a commodity, when you're converting an object into a commodity, what you're essentially doing is you're basically looking at the cultural condition around it and then branding it accordingly. You're constructing it through sentiments, through affect, through a variety of networks in order to appeal to a certain kind of consumer. Okay, now, of course, what we will find also as we look at these advertisements is there's a very interesting relationship between the effect in advertisements and contemporary value system, right? Because in other words, what we consume is also dependent on the value system. What we should consume, what we should not consume, what is good for consumption, what is bad for consumption. So all this value system, the knowledge system of the consumer is very, very important when we look at a certain kind of advertisement. Okay, so for instance, in a culture which forbids alcohol drinking, advertising alcohol consumption would be a negative advertisement, because it's obviously dependent. It's sort of drawing on a moral system. It's drawing on a moral structure, and if it's branding a commodity as alcoholic, then obviously that would go anathema. That would be counterproductive, because that culture forbids drinking. That culture, it doesn't allow that kind of a practice, that kind of a ritual. So, you can also do a very interesting anthropological ritual study, if you look at advertisements. So why do certain kind of commodities flourish on certain cultural conditions and don't sell at all in certain other cultural conditions, right? So there are certain cultural conditions with certain value systems which are very uniquely located, very uniquely situated at that spaces, right? So the space, again, we come back to the use of the word space, which is something which we did already when we looked at Shraddha Khilari, when we looked at Heart of Darkness, when we looked at in a look back in anger, and almost all the texts which we covered in this particular course. How does space create gendered identity? So how does space create an effect, and how does it affect extend onto an identity, right, which is playful, performative, and plastic, right? And we will look at one particular slide which is from a film. It's a very important, it's a very interesting film, and it's obviously a very famous film. It's called The Godfather, directed by Francis Ford Coppola, and we will see a particular clip from the film at some point later in this last segment of this course, where we look at how the relation between space and gendered identity is almost directly related to each other. So how to behave in a particular way, in a particularly gendered way, in a certain kind of space, and how to behave quite differently if you're relocated to another kind of space. Okay, so again, space is a very loaded term in gender studies, because spatial identity is very, very important, because it's sort of certain spaces require or demand a certain kind of embodiment, right? And certain other spaces obviously demand a different kind of embodiment. So this demand for a certain kind of embodiment is dependent on your spatial location. Where are you situated at any particular point in time? Right? So these are very complex questions, but these are questions which we need to engage with if we are to do any sophisticated study of gender and its representation in society, culture, and politics at large. Now, having given you this idea of space, affective identity, sentiment, association, disassociation, and how all these things play out together, and creating and recreating identities, and selling and commodifying identities which appeal to a certain kind of consumer, let us look at a way in which gender becomes sort of dramatically playful, dramatically spectacular in the world of advertisements, right? Because it's very, we've been talking about so far in this course how human beings are gendered, right? So how there's a certain kind of masculinity, there's a certain kind of femininity which are contingent on certain political situations. So in a certain political condition, certain cultural condition demand a certain kind of masculinity, and likewise certain political and cultural conditions demand a certain kind of femininity. And we looked at how Shraddha Khilari by Munshi Premchand, the chess players which we studied as part of the course, it sort of demands whether the relationship between the demand and supply is interrupted, because the political condition demands a certain kind of masculinity which the people in the story fail to deliver, and as a result they are marginalized and pushed away, and in Premchand's story they die. It's a very symbolic death, because that death symbolizes the death of that kind of identity, right? That kind of gender identity, and obviously it paves the way, it indicates, it anticipates a different kind of gender identity which is about to enter the space, which, as we know, when we looked at the story, is the British imperial masculinity, which is about to enter the space of Lucknow, and the masculinity on its way out is a feudal Nawabi masculinity, because of the political changes which have occurred through the war, through imperialism, through other kinds of economic exploitation, etc. Okay, so space, affect, identity, consumption, all these things are very, very important in gender studies, particularly if you look at representations of gender, because obviously the word representation is very important. It's how do you represent gender identities. It's not just it will not suffice simply to say that okay, this is the way gender operates in a particular space. If you need to look at the representational in politics, so how is gender represented, and why do representations change depending on economic conditions, depending on political conditions, depending on consumers' conditions, etc. Okay, so these are the things which you have to bear in mind. And the other thing which we will be very, very watchful, we'll look out for when we look at these texts as as case studies of gender, is the kind of the politics of stereotypification, right? So certain kind of gender stereotypes are constructed, are corroborated, are consolidated in certain kinds of advertisements, and likewise certain other kinds of advertisements deconstruct those gender identities. And more importantly, which brings me to the very important point, which is probably the most important point in this particular lecture, is how even inanimate objects, things like pen, pencil, pieces of food, products of food, vehicles, etc. These are also gendered depending on the cultural, social conditions and economic conditions. So something as inanimate, as a glass of milk, sometimes something as inanimate as an apple, something as inanimate as a pen. All these things, can be gendered, regendered, degendered, and different kinds of conditions, depending, of course, on the contemporary cultural, political, and immediate, conditions of embodiment. Okay, so even inanimate objects, things which do not live, which do not speak, which do not have any voice, things which do not, quote unquote, matter because they are just, pieces of matter. So, even those objects, particularly when they're converted into commodities, they become gendered, right? And obviously, once you create a certain kind of gender identity out of an object by converting it into a commodity, it's also possible perfectly to regender it, degender and then regender it and make it into some kind of other commodity, which will be bought and consumed by some other kind of culture, by certain other kind of clientele. Okay, so again, this entanglement between stereotypification and deconstruction of inanimate entities, which become gendered very, very quickly. These become very, very important, pieces of analysis when we look at advertisements, particularly in a context of gender. Okay, so what I'll do now is I will go through certain advertisements. We will mainly do 3 videos. There are 3 videos in which you'll be asked questions. And I'll mention the videos before I play these videos, but for the purpose of giving you a preamble to the other main videos, I'll play some other videos which will sort of give you an idea of how the stereotypes are constructed in gender identities, how they become important, how they become, sometimes subversive, sometimes, consolidating, corroborating a very sexist division of gender, dualism of gender, etc. So how, certain kind of advertisements are important because they corroborate the dualism, and likewise certain other kinds of advertisements are important because they deconstruct the dualism. Okay, so in either ways, dualism is a very important factor in gender, especially if you look at advertisements as a kind of representation of politics. Okay, now the first video I will play when I look at the relationship between gender and identity is something which is very, very interesting, and that is the video of a certain kind of alcoholic beverage. Now, obviously, as you know, alcoholic beverage, first of all, the first thing we need to know about alcoholic beverage is that it's not really a commodity which is universally consumed. So there are certain kinds, and again, the reason why I'm playing this because the questions of race, class, location, all these come into being when we look at the gendered politics. Okay, we saw when we read Look Back in Anger by John Osborne, we saw how important class is, how important race is when we look at gender. Now, even this advertisement, which sort of advertises a certain kind of alcoholic beverage, is very important because not only should we be looking at the division of gender, we should also be looking at the location of class, the location of race in this particular advertisement. Because this is a certain kind of race, certain kind of class which this advertisement is addressing. And within that race, within that class, we have a division of gender. So this is the advertisement which we are playing. So the video will be up in a minute, and just take a look and then we'll discuss it as we move on.
Nou, dit is dus de huiskamer. En dan komen we hier bij de slaapkamer. Oh, ja. Met...
Okay, so what we saw is obviously very, very sexist, because what it does very clearly, it divides the commodities into a very gendered kind of a thing. So the assumption that we get in this particular advertisement is that women love shops, love shoes, and men love beer. Men love alcohol and women love shoes. So again, if you look at the politics of consumption away, so the assumption is, women go for certain kind of products because they're feminine, and men go for certain other kinds of products because they're masculine. So the entire division of masculinity and femininity, which is happening not through human beings, mind you, but through objects, inanimate objects, the bottles of beer or shoes. These don't speak, these don't really have any human gender, but they are gendered in this particular advertisement, and we'll see many more examples in the times to come. But this brings me to the important point which we started off with when we actually started this course. that when I said that gender doesn't really depend on biology, this is exactly what I meant. Right? Now, there's no biological division over here. There's nothing biological about a bottle of beer. There's nothing biological about shoes. There's nothing biological about necklaces. There's nothing biological about, I don't know, motorbikes. Okay? But these things are deeply gendered. So, in other words, the gendering of these inanimate objects, the gendering of these commodities does not depend on biology, because they don't have any biology. You can't really say these are anatomically and organically male, or organically and anatomically female. You can't say that about shoe. You cannot say that about motorbikes. You cannot say that about anything really, because these are inanimate objects. But what makes them gendered, what makes them really complexly gendered, especially in a very divisive, dualistic kind of a way, is the way they're represented. Okay, so and again, look at the way how representation and affiliation through sentiment happens in this particular advertisement. Okay, so the woman walked into a very fancy wardrobe, and it's a bunch of women, and the wardrobe is full of very expensive shoes, and obviously the women are very pleased. They are, they scream with joy, and they're admiring the wardrobe, etc. And then, of course, what we see immediately is that there's a louder shriek, there's a louder scream, and that's because we've seen men who walked into a massive fridge full of beer. Okay, and the assumption is men. This is a manly thing, walking into a fridge of beer, and so they're screaming, as men would. And again, the way the men express themselves, they scream more, they shout more. They're wilder, they're more physical, etc. So again, we find all these things play together in a very interesting way in this particular advertisement. But again, before I move even further on into the politics of gender, notice the way in which the consumer, who is a consumer of this kind of product? We're not talking about, very old or very poor, people from, somewhere in Nigeria, where people don't get any food to eat, where people die of cholera and malaria, and there are different kinds of diseases. We're not talking about somewhere in Tibet. We're not talking about, somewhere in the deep interiors of Peru, etc. Or we're not talking about somewhere in a culture where alcohol consumption is banned, either religiously or morally or emotionally or politically. The kind of people which you see in this particular advertisement is they're very obviously wealthy white people who belong in an Anglo-Saxon world, who subscribe or consume an Anglo-Saxon moral system. And I use the word consume quite deliberately. It's a really loaded word, because the advertisement shows two different kinds of consumptions, doesn't it? So it shows the feminine kind of consumption, which consumes the shoes, the fancy shoes, etc., and it shows the masculine consumption, which is supposed to consume and alcoholic beverage, etc. Okay, so again, even the manner of consumption, the politics of consumption, the culture of consumption is deeply gendered. Okay, and obviously the clientele for this particular advertisement is a very wealthy white clientele. Now, the reason why I played this ad in the beginning is it doesn't take a rocket scientist for you to understand the binary over here. So the very obvious sexist binary is that men love alcoholic beverage and women love fancy shoes. And obviously we're talking about white wealthy men and white wealthy women. So the question of race and class also sort of come in. And the questions of race and class also come in when we're talking about gender and divisions of gender and representations of gender in this particular advertisement. So it's a very important point to remember, because this is something which we studied or discussed extensively when we read Look Back in Anger. So how we can't possibly do a gender reading of Look Back in Anger without bringing the question of class or imperialism or politics or ideology and all that in the context of the play. So this particular advertisement by Heineken, it serves the purpose of corroborating the division between genders, right? So again, and this is something which we've been studying from the very beginning of this course. So if you go back to Prem Chand's Shatranj Khiladi or the chess players, that's something which we saw there. Men, stay in a certain kind of space, women stay in another kind of space, and it's deeply gendered. Men do certain things, women do certain other things, and the two never crisscross each other. There's hardly a dialogue with each other, and that's deeply gendered as well. But we see something similar happening even in the millennium, the new millennium. So this is like 2000 and this 21st century, and even then we have this division of labor, this division of consumption, this division of location. So very clearly, location and space becomes a very important factor. Because if you remember this advertisement, the woman walked into a wardrobe. which is supposed to be a quote-unquote female space, right? It's a wardrobe full of shoes. So again, the location of consumption, the location of appreciation is very, very important. So it's not as if the men and women standing together and looking at different things. So the men go into a different thing, the women go into another different thing, and they look at different objects which become commodities by default because of the gaze, the way the look is sort of presented. So we have the difference between the male gaze and the female gaze, but more importantly, the gaze is operative only in a particular site, right? So the site in the case of a female is that of a massive fancy wardrobe. The site in the case of a male surveyor is a massive fancy fridge, full of alcoholic beverage. So again, the site of appreciation, the site of articulation, the site of reception, the site of consumption, so all these become very, very important things in terms of the way we look at gender and the way it's represented in this advertisement. And the reason why I keep talking about race, I keep talking about the class, I keep talking about the politics of consumption is because you can't possibly divorce, especially if you're looking at advertisements, you can't possibly divorce away the location of the consumer, the quality of the consumer, the racial identity of the consumer, the agency of the consumer. So all these become very important. So this advertisement will not work at all in a climate where alcohol drinking is prohibited. This will not work at all in a climate where men can't afford this kind of drink, where women can't afford this kind of shoes. It will only work in a kind of climate, in a kind of economic, cultural climate where people tend to buy these things, where people tend to make decisions, where people tend to subscribe to this kind of a commodity culture, right? So it's very important to understand that the location of the consumer, the location of the clientele of the advertisement is very important when we look at the politics of representation, especially when it comes to gender and a certain kind of advertisement. Now, so this was an easy ad, and I started off as an easy advertisement because it's that stereotypical sexist kind of way in which we say only women go for fancy shoes and men go for strong drinks because that's manly, and women go for fancy delicate shoes because that's very, very feminine. That's something which is very sexist and divisive and dualistic, etc. There's no it's a complete consolidation of commodity difference over here, right? So we don't need to be overtly aware of the complexities over here. It's not a complex ad at all. So I deliberately started off with a non-complex ad. It's something which we can understand and associate very, very clearly. But what if, and this is important, what if we're looking at a commodity, we're looking at a particular product which is trying to sort of rebrand itself, right? Which is trying to break away from the erstwhile branding. So for instance, if product X used to be branded as feminine, right? Now the company or the product manufacturer wants to open it up to a bigger, wider market. Now it can't do it possibly if it continues to be feminine only, if it continues to be consumed by the females only. So what does it need to do? It needs to actually rebrand itself in a way in which it will open up to both the genders, right? So we're talking about binaries over here, right? In a very binaristic kind of a way. It'll open up, it'll appeal to men as well as women. It'll appeal to all kinds of genders. It'll appeal to a wider audience. It'll appeal to, it'll cut across class, it'll cut across political location, it'll cut across race, it'll cut across all kinds of things, right? But of course, the other thing which we need to remember is that, if you look at advertisements, one thing we need to be very aware of, or very sensitive to advertisements is every advertisement, every work of advertisement is embedded in a particular model system. Okay, so in a model system where alcohol drinking is forbidden, in a model system where alcohol drinking is frowned upon, this particular advertisement will be a disaster, right? So if you look at it from an advertisement perspective, if a filmmaker's perspective, someone who's making this film for the ad, that particular advertisement will not work at all if we are talking about a culture which is very conservative, a culture where it's conservative about drinking alcohol, etc. So again, the moral system of the consumer, the moral system is very, very important when it comes to gendered representations, especially in advertisements. Okay, now the next advertisement, which I'll play in a minute, it does something more complex, and I'm beginning to move from a very simple, sexist, dualistic kind of representation to perhaps a more complex representation, which we ask more questions about it. Now, this particular ad which stars a very, very popular actor, as we know, a very popular footballer. But before I play this, I'll play another advertisement which will corroborate, which will sort of again hammer home the point that a certain kind of branding, a certain kind of gendering is important when it comes to a certain brand. So this is not really an advertisement, but it's sort of a little clip which I'll play, which is an extension of the earlier ad which we just saw. So just look at it for a second, and then we'll move on to the second advertisement which I'll play. So this is the second clip which we'll see, which is a very simple thing to understand, but it still needs to be played. So this is how it is. Okay, so I mean, it's a very simple thing to understand, really. So what we see over here is a complete example of commodification. So I use the word commodification quite frequently, and I will use it when I look at advertisements. And the other word which you can use is reification, R-E-I-F-I-C-A-T-I-O-N, which means the same thing. To reify something, R-E-I-F-Y, is to commodify something. So everything can be converted into a commodity with a price tag. So we saw over here a footballer, David Beckham, who is sort of everything about him in this particular advertisement is a commodity. So he's wearing a particular jacket which costs something. He's wearing a particular sweatshirt which costs something. And again, the whole branding is a very male kind of branding. So it's an all-male space where he enters, where the men have complete control, where the men have agency, where the men have operational skills, and there he sort of gets in and displays this superior masculinity through a very performative act. So all these little things which we did at the beginning of this course, mimicry, performativity, identity formation, etc., agency. So all these things come together, and they are sort of displayed spectacularly. They're embedded in advertisements, and you only have to look out for it, and it's all there. So this particular advertisement, H&M, which stars David Beckham in it. So it's a very classic example of commodification and also performativity. Because if you look at what happens in advertisement, I'll play it again. So if you look at the final shot, if you look at the final shot in this particular billiard game, it's a very performative one, right? It's something which is excessive, it's spectacular, it's over the top. No one can possibly do it in a normal circumstances, right? So obviously this is sort of choreographed, and it's meant to entertain you, it's meant to fascinate you in a way which is hyper real. So again, the very excessive performative quality of the act is something which is emphasized, something which is dramatized. So, because it's performative, it is excessive, it is over the top, it is something which happens in a very big way, in a very fashionable way, and in a very stylized way, etc. And that obviously is part of the masculinity package, which we see over here. Because he represents a certain kind of masculinity, and it's a very privileged masculinity, because it's white, it's wealthy, so racially, linguistically, economically, it's a very privileged kind of gender identity that he displays over here, right? So this is a continuation. So this particular clip, or this advertisement, as you'd call it, is essentially a continuation of the earlier one. The earlier one had this very dualistic understanding of men and women, male and female, the male fantasy and the female fantasy, the male object of desire, the female object of desire, the male kind of consumption, the female kind of consumption. So it's a very binaristic, divisive, dualistic kind of a politics of representation which we saw in the earlier advertisement. But this one, the H&M one, starring David Beckham, so it's a continuation of that. So it looks at a product as a very male, alpha male product. So it's a kind of a designer dress. It's a kind of a designer system, meant for men, not just for men, but for hegemonic men. So the point is, the message is, if you're wearing this product, if you're wearing this kind of dress, you are essentially privileged. you're essentially in a position of power. You're essentially in a position of authority. And if you want to take all these words together, the word which you'll be looking for is agency. You are in a position of superior, authorized agency. So authority and agency are something which are linked together in this particular advertisement. So this is a simple ad as well, something which is very easy to understand how this would work. It's very easy to understand why this would be popular, and it's very easy to understand what the product or the manufacturer of the product is trying to get at. So if you read this, you are a performative, superior, hegemonic man, right? You are embodying that kind of masculinity. Now we'll see another ad later, and that's one of the text ads, and I'll mention that. It's a text ad because you can expect questions from it, in your examination. We will see that particular ad later. We find that it sort of deconstructs the relationship between commodity and masculinity. Now this one, the Beckham ad, it sort of establishes the relationship between commodity and masculinity. So if you wear this commodity, you are a superior man. You already were a superior man, but you become a more superior man, and just by wearing this particular commodity, by consuming this particular commodity. Okay, so the first two advertisements which you've seen today in this particular lecture, they are so simple, simplistic, binaristic, sexist, in a very heavy-handed kind of a way, because they play on the dualism of man and woman, male and female, etc. Right? Because they're talking about products which are definitely sort of belong to a certain kind of gendered location. So they're talking about products such as shoes and beer. They're talking about products such as leather jackets and very, very manly garments. And obviously the whole idea is they belong to certain gendered locations. Now the next ad, which I'll play in a minute, does something more complex. It stars a very popular Indian actor, Shah Rukh Khan, in a very interesting angle, because the commodity that has been the actor is trying to sell over here through the advertisement, through the narrative of the advertisement, is not traditionally a male commodity. Right? It used to be gendered in a different kind of way. It used to be gendered in a female kind of a way. Now, what this advertisement tries to do, what this advertisement attempts to achieve through its process of representation, is to debrand the product, from the very essentialized female kind of product, and then rebrand it as something which is masculine. So the advertisement is that of a fair and handsome cream. Now, fair and handsome cream is something of a recent phenomenon in the advertisement market, especially in India. Because prior to that, you had fair and lovely cream, you had fairness creams for women. Because the entire idea was that it's only women who need to look fair. It's only women, who need to look beautiful. Men don't need fairness. Men don't need beauty, because that's a manly thing to do. Not needing to be beautiful is manly, by that particular moral standard. Now, of course, what we find with the introduction of the new kind of creams where men need to look beautiful, where men need to look fair, where men need to look handsome, is because a certain kind of moral system has changed, where it is okay for men, it is actually desirable for men to look beautiful and handsome and fair and all the rest of it. So division, which was there earlier in terms of fairness, so it's only women who need to be fair and men can be whatever, that division begins to give away, and we have a very more complex situation where fairness can also belong to men as well as to women. However, this is a caveat in the ad, and this is what I'm trying to get at. It can't possibly say that it's the same kind of fairness, right? It can't possibly say this is a fairness, this is the same fairness, which was desired by the woman. So, but what it does say instead is that this is the kind of fairness which is just purely men for men, right? So in other words, if you're using the Fair and Lovely cream, the old fairness cream, that's not going to work because you're still a man, right? And you need to be fair, but in a manly kind of a way. So the product tries to say that this is a cream which will make you fair because it's okay to be fair, it is desirable to be fair. However, the fairness process will be achieved only in a very manly way. So the manliness of the process is something which is interesting and something which we'll look at when we study this particular ad. So, and there are more complex questions as well. There's a question of class. There's a question of societal location. So what class is being addressed over here? What kind of location has been addressed over here, whether it's an urban location or a rural location, what kind of value system is addressed over here. So all these questions come into being, because remember, this is something I've been telling you from the very beginning of this course, you can't possibly look at gender as a divorced, abstract phenomenon. So along with gender, the questions of class, the questions of identity, questions of caste, questions of political locations, all these things will come in a very heavy way. And even this particular advertisement does something quite complex, and of course in a very regressive way. But we're looking at this as a text. We're looking at all these as text. So we're not sort of judging them as progressive or regressive. So we're looking at how the different gendered codes, and it's a very coded system, of course. So how this very coded quality of gender formation and identity formation, so how do these codes play out in this particular advertisement? So how are these codes recoded, right? And then, of course, decoded and recoded, and then rebranded in different commodities, etc. So commodity formation and codification, they're very similar processes. So the process through which an object becomes a commodity is a very codified process. And we look at how that codified process works in this particular advertisement. So this is a Fair and Handsome cream advertisement starring the Indian actor Shah Rukh Khan. So this is how it goes.
ओ पहलवान लड़कियों वाली फेयरनेस क्रीम लगा रहा है, कल नेल पॉलिश लगाएगा, परसों लिपस्टिक, हाँ? लंगोट उतार, लहंगा लपेट ले।
पहलवान फेयर एंड हैंडसम लगा। मर्दों की त्वचा होती है सख्त, जिस पे लड़कियों वाली फेयरनेस क्रीम बेअसर। सिर्फ इमामी फेयर एंड हैंडसम में है अमेरिकन लुमिनोपेप्टाइड, जो किसी भी साधारण मर्दों वाली फेयरनेस क्रीम से ज्यादा असरदार, ज्यादा फास्ट।
इमामी फेयर एंड हैंडसम, दुनिया की नंबर 1 फेयरनेस क्रीम मर्दों के लिए।
Okay, so as we can see, I mean, if you're really watching this carefully, I mean, it's a very complex text. A lot of things are happening in this text. So the first sight of the text is a very rural wrestling arena. It's an agam where we have very muscular men who probably belong to a certain kind of societal location. They're practicing wrestling, etc. Not in a fancy gymnasium, but in a village mat, in a village agam. Okay, so this is where the story starts in this particular advertisement. Now we find there a particular wrestler, a very manly wrestler, of course. He's sort of trying to put a certain kind of fairness cream, which is reprimanded, which is sort of frowned upon, because it's sort of described as the female fairness cream, which should not work, which it's not supposed to work for men. And the way he is reprimanded for using that particular cream is a very visual kind of a way. So first of all, the actor comes and tells him that how dare you put on the female fairness cream. So if you replay it, you watch it again, and you find it as a really rich text, very complex text. Of course, it's very regressive, but that's the whole point. Right? Now, the actor comes and tells the wrestler that how dare you put on the female fairness cream, because the next thing you know, you're probably putting on lipstick, you're probably putting on nail polish, and the whole process is parody. The whole process is sort of, it becomes a very grotesque comedy, as you saw in the advertisement, right? So he's almost sort of penalized for putting on the female fairness cream, because the whole idea is, you essentially emasculating yourself. You're not really manly anymore, because the whole point of putting on a female fairness cream is a process of emasculation, and that's something that is sort of really, really frowned upon by the actor in this particular piece of advertisement. So what does it suggest instead? It says if you really are to be fair, which is a fine thing, fairness is a very desirable thing for men as well. But the whole point is, if you really are to be fair, you need to use a particular cream which is meant for the male skin. So you should not be using the Fair and Lovely cream. What you should be using is a Fair and Handsome cream, because the word handsome, remember, and again, this is a very old thing which we've been talking about for a long time. There's certain adjectives which are gendered as well. Now, it's very rare that you'd call a woman handsome. Although you could grammatically, right? There's nothing ungrammatical about calling a woman handsome, right? So it's not grammatically incorrect if you call a woman handsome. But it's more conventional to call a man handsome, because that's the kind of way the adjective has evolved to a very gendered process, right? So the Fair and Handsome cream is a very important distinction from the Fair and Lovely cream, because again, the word lovely is sort of quote unquote more feminine. You very rarely would call a man lovely, a lovely looking man. It's not really quote unquote manly in a stereotypical, conventional, conservative kind of a way. So again, look at the way how the signifiers change. from lovely to handsome. The words change, the adjectives change, and of course, through the process of the sign changing, the letters have changed, etc. The branding is also being changed. So it's a process of debranding and then rebranding. So, the actor tells the wrestler in the end that, if you really are to be fair, which is a great thing, you should aspire to be fair through a manly process. So put on a fair and handsome cream, which he does. So thanks to the actor's advice, he does put on the fair and handsome cream, and the effect is immediate. It's immediately desirable. So, and interestingly, what we find in the end of the advertisement is that, he's sort of putting on a green T-shirt, is wearing a jeans, which is a complete contrast to what he was wearing at the beginning of the advertisement. So at the beginning of the advertisement, he was wearing just this really red short, which is sort of worn by professional wrestlers, and he's obviously bare-bodied. The torso was bare, and he was wearing red shorts. And in complete contrast, and a really dramatic contrast to that, we find in the end of the advertisement that he's wearing a green T-shirt with jeans, and not just that, he's got a bag slung on his shoulders, and is walking out. And there's a group of women who are looking at him very admiringly, and are singing a very sort of a choric song, calling him fair and handsome. Right? So it's not just about gender, and this is something I should be telling you, and obviously most of you would know by now. It's not just about gender that we're talking about. It's not just about manning up using a particular product. It's also about mobility. So what we find over here is an example of social mobility. So this particular person moves from becoming a very rural wrestler into this sort of quasi-cosmopolitan, metropolitan man who is presumably going to college, is wearing a jeans, jeans trousers and a green T-shirt. So obviously that is an indicator, a signifier of some kind of a social mobility, urbanity. He's more urbane now compared to what he was at the beginning of the particular advertisement. So all these things come together and suggest a very interesting social study. So if you look at advertisements, and obviously this is the key thing, advertisements are very rich social text. They tell you a lot about that particular social culture. They tell you a lot in terms of what's happening to society, how is society evolving, so what's the contemporary social system, what's the contemporary moral system, so what kind of consumer's morality do you have in that particular system. If you look at this advertisement, the immediate implication is, this is a bit of a changing India where men need to look fair. So it's not just enough that you're wrestling and you have a very muscled body. It's also important that you're fair. But of course, if you're fair through a female process, a quote-unquote female process, it's the process of emasculation, and you're parodied and penalized for it. And of course, if you remember the images where he's putting on lipstick, where he's putting on a very crude nail polish, and and it's also wearing a frock at one point. It's a bit of a visual sequence which you see in the advertisement. So he's putting on a frock. So he's instead of wrestling with the wrestler, he's dancing with the wrestler wearing a frock. So the whole thing becomes a grotesque parody of masculinity. So, that is being, very, very quickly shut down. And of course, the way to promote yourself is through a manly process. So the fairness cream, which emerges in the end, is a fair and handsome cream, which he puts on. And in the process, he becomes a truly manly in a metropolitan kind of a way. So it's not just about masculinity. It's not just about masculinity and femininity. It's also about mobility. So the product promises not just urbane masculinity. It also promises mobility. It also promises social mobility. It also sort of tells you that if you use this product, you're not just becoming a good-looking man. You're becoming a sort of a more mobile man. You're becoming a more desirable man. So, and that's a very important point. So this is what the product does. Aims to achieve. Whether it achieves or not is a different question, but it aims to achieve through this diegetic process in the advertisement film. So the three ads which we've seen so far, and I'm sort of concluding now, the three ads which you've seen so far, they do very similar as well as just similar things. So the first advertisement which you saw, which was a Heineken beer advertisement, it sort of looks at a certain kind of beverage, a certain kind of culture of consumption, right? And it's a very binaristic, divisive kind of a culture of consumption. So the obvious assumption is, as I mentioned, the automatic assumption is it's only the women who wear fancy shoes, and men don't wear fancy shoes. Men couldn't care less about fancy shoes, and it's only the men who drink alcoholic beverage, and women don't drink alcoholic beverage at all. And it's obviously the euphoria of the woman is drowned immediately by the euphoria of the men. The men are even more joyous at the sight of beer than they are at the sight of in a wardrobe. And again, the location is very important, space is very important away, as I keep saying. So the speciality of the wardrobe is very, very female, it's very, very feminized in this particular advertisement, whereas the speciality of the alcohol fridge, the fridge full of alcohol, is sort of masculinized. It's something of a manly space, etc. It's a very divisive kind of a representation of politics, which we saw in the advertisement. Now, the second advertisement starring David Beckham, which was an H&M advertisement, it was a manly designer dress kind of a product, which we saw. And of course, it's an extension of the first advertisement in the sense that, you know, it's trying to commodify and consolidate a certain brand of masculinity, wealthy, white masculinity. And the assumption is, if you're consuming this product, if you're wearing this product, you know, if you're subscribing to this product, then you obviously, you know, hegemonic by default. You know, you belong to this hegemonic gendered location by default. You know, not just because of your biological location, but also because of your racial, your political, your ethnic location. Okay, so all these things come together as well. The third advertisement which we saw is perhaps the most complex one of the three, where we saw how a particular kind of masculinity, rural wrestling kind of masculinity, it tries to surreptitiously, it tries to make itself more fair, the man, by using, because it's ignorant, it doesn't know what's happening in the consumer world. He's using an old fairness cream for women. The cream for women is a cream for men, and the idea over here, what the advertisement wants to show, is that the men's skin are different, so the creams are different. So the skin and cream thing are equated over here in terms of the politics of difference. So the advertisement tells us, or the wrestler inside the advertisement, who's a hearer and the consumer as well, the listener and the consumer as well, that if you are to be fair, you should do it through a manly process. So if you're doing it, if you're going for this fairness process through using female products, then you're parodied and penalized. Then it's like wearing lipsticks, it's like wearing a frock in a wrestling match, it's like wearing nail polish in a very crude kind of a way. So the whole idea is to parody, and these are not quote unquote prestigious things. These are not really manly things. These are not really respectable things. These are laughable things. So again, you are being laughed at. You're being laughed at because you're doing the wrong thing. You're doing a stupid thing. You are actually subscribing to a wrong code of gender. Now, if you are to subscribe to a right code of gender, you should go for a fair and handsome cream, because the word handsome is important. It's a manly word. So is the product. So the fair and handsome cream will make you handsome in a manly kind of a way. And not just that, it'll also make you upwardly mobile. It'll give you some kind of a social mobility upwards. Because at the end of the advertisement, we find that instead of being a wrestler, instead of continuing to being a wrestler, he's presumably going for some kind of a is probably going to college or something. He's wearing a green shirt, green t-shirt, and a jeans, and he's got a little bag slung on his shoulder, which is indicator that maybe he's going for some kind of an educational program. Not only he's not just wasting his time in a wrestling agony, and there's a row of women who is admiring him, calling him fair and handsome. So again, the whole package of location, societal location, whether it's a rural location or urban location, class, ethnicity, race, they come into being. And of course, mind you, the most fundamental thing is this is a culture which sort of worships fairness. This is a culture which appreciates fairness. This is a culture which wants to consume fairness. Now again, when I said in the beginning, the first advertisement, that the Heineken beer advertisement will not work in a very sort of in a culture where alcohol drinking is forbidden, because there's a moral system there, against which this particular advertisement will not work, because the kind of spirit that advertisement wants to sell is completely in conflict with a model map that certain people, certain locations will have. Now, likewise, the fair and handsome cream will not work in a white world, because in a white world, no one would care to be handsome through a fair process, right? In a white world, no one would care to be handsome by becoming fair. So the equation between handsomeness and fairness will not work in a white world. So this particular advertisement will not work in Europe. This particular advertisement will not work in Northern America or any other part of the white world. So I'm using the word white in a sort of a racial kind of a way. It will only work in a racial location where fairness is desirable, in other words, a non-white space. Now, interestingly, in a white space, you might get a similar advertisement for a tanning cream because, to get your skin tanned as a white person is a desirable thing because, it makes you more attractive in that kind of a moral, erotic parameter, and that kind of a gaze, it makes you more attractive. But, in this particular map, in this particular moral system, becoming white, becoming fair becomes desirable. So again, I'll conclude with this. We're looking at some very interesting and complex correspondences between gendered identity, moral location, gendered location, economic location, societal location, all these things coming together. So, you can't really pick up one and shred away everything else because, they're all linked together in a very asymmetric kind of a way. So you don't quite know what ends and when the other begins, etc. It's all entangled together in a very heavy, complex process. So hopefully, you enjoyed watching these advertisements and you treat these advertisements as text for your course. And of course, I'll mention which of the texts you should be treating as examination texts. So none of these texts will be used as examination texts, but this is just to give you an idea of the kind of culture, the visual culture, consumer culture that certain advertisements want to promote to a very gendered and coded idea of identity. Okay, so this concludes the first lecture of the last segment of Gender in Literature, which is about advertisements and popular culture and films, etc. So in the next lecture, I'll show you more advertisements and we'll talk a little more about how gender locations and configurations are played and replayed depending on the moral, societal and ideological climates. So thank you for your attention and I'll see you in the next class.